Hi BookTube, it's Amy, and it is a beautiful snowy Saturday morning. So what better thing to do than to sit inside and talk to you about what I've read and what I plan to read this weekend. So I posted a video earlier this week talking about Thomas Harris's novel The Silence of the Lambs. So I won't say much more about this here. If you're interested in my thoughts on this book, go and check out my separate video for this one. But because I read that one and enjoyed it so much, I went ahead and I purchased Thomas Harris's first novel that talks about Hannibal. So The Silence of the Lambs is the second in a series, but it's the most popular, and so it's often read as a standalone. But Red Dragon actually takes place chronologically before this novel, and I believe it was published before that one as well. So I'm going to be reading this the next couple of days, probably all today, if I'm being honest. So the synopsis for this one says, when he was an FBI agent, Will Graham risked his sanity to capture Dr. Hannibal Lecter, an ingenious killer like no other. Now Graham is following the blood-stained pattern of the Tooth Fairy, a madman who's already wiped out 2 families. To find him, Graham has to understand him. To understand him, Graham has only one place left to go, to the mind of Dr. Lecter. So it sounds like a very similar premise to The Silence of the Lambs. Only, of course, our detective is Will Graham instead of Clarice. And we'll see whether Will Graham is as interesting a character as Clarice was to read about. So that's what I'm up to today. But last week, I ended up DNFing a Stephen King novel just because it was so bad. And I just spilled the cup of tea I was holding, so ouch. I've got it all over my wrist here. It's a good thing it wasn't too hot. But as I said, I ended up DNFing a Stephen King novel, and that is his novel Dreamcatcher. The premise seemed interesting, and I was actually pretty drawn in for the first few pages until this group of guys got going on their hunting trip, and it just got really boring, and they discovered these strangers who essentially have really smelly farts. And that's not a joke, that's literally what happened here. Someone I was talking to this one about said that there's rumors that he wrote it when he was on painkillers, so that's perhaps why it's a little odd and out there. It was published in 2001, and of course it's one of his fairly large ones, and not one I was willing to read more of. Just because I found those first 100 pages or so pretty boring, and my philosophy for this year is I don't have time to read books that I'm not enjoying. I set my Goodreads goal really low this year. I actually set it to 10 books, and I reached that goal already. So it's not about volume, it's about reading what I enjoy, and I have no qualms anymore. If I'm not enjoying something, I'm just going to set it down, and I don't have time for that. So I DNF'd that one, and that will be going to the thrift store. But then I also ended up reading Air Force Girl by Renee Shawn, which I did tell you in my last Friday reads I would be reading. So this is the vintage 1940s romance novel. And although it was pretty entertaining, it was one of those novels where I wished I could have rewritten the ending. I wished it were a little bit less ridiculous in terms of the insta-romance. So basically the premise here is we have Jane, and she is about to join the Air Force, the WAAFs, I think it's called, W-A-A-F. I don't think they actually explain what that stands for. I believe this would have been published in the UK in 1942, and so anybody picking up this novel would have known, obviously, what that was. But she joins the women's chapter in the Air Force. And the night before she's going out to do that, she literally bumps into a man on the street. And he is a little bit upset because his date has bailed on him, and so he invites her to spend the evening with him instead. And for whatever reason, we get some insta romance here. And she, of course, sneaks off near the end of the date, knowing that she's about to go into the Air Force and leave this city. Of course, the catch is, of course, he's also in the Air Force, and a few weeks later, they once again literally run into each other in a hallway. Now, the weird part about this is it's been, 2-3 weeks since they spent one evening together, and this man, I'm forgetting his name all of a sudden, I'm remembering his actual name, but his nickname, Tips. He goes by the name of Tips. And Tips runs into her and says, where did you sneak off to? You know you're going to marry me, right? And she oddly and abruptly gets engaged to this man that she's now met for the second time in a hallway. Then she finds out that, lo and behold, this man Tips is her roommate's ex-husband. And of course that complicates things, and he's running around with another woman, which makes her a little wary because this other woman is married, and her roommate, she had divorced him because she had suspicions he was running around with another woman. So he just comes off as a bit of a jerk, and we're not sure why Jane is even considering marrying him, especially when she has Stella around. Now, of course, this is 1942, so it wasn't meant to be that way, most likely. Or maybe the author was trying to sneak stuff in, make us think. But we're presented in the opening scenes of this novel with the friendship between Jane and her slightly older roommate Stella. And Jane recounts for us, for the reader, how she and Stella met. So they met at a party, they clicked instantly, decided at that moment that they had to get together the next day. They became close friends and shortly after moved in together as roommates. Jane recounts an instance where Stella literally stole her passport and hid it to prevent her from going off to Paris with a man she was seeing. Now, of course, that could be just because, Stella's trying to protect Jane's virtue, so to speak. But to me, that just sounds like another motive altogether. Like Stella just doesn't want her roommate Jane going off with a man, any man, and Stella says she has no plans to marry again, claiming that she's still in love with her ex-husband Tips, who she left. And then when Jane goes off to the Air Force, well, everyone else is putting out pictures of their boyfriends, their beaux, of their parents maybe on the bedside. She just pulls out a picture of Stella and sets that beside her bed, and there's this little conversation where one of the other women near her says, "Oh, is that your sister?" And Jane says, "No, that's my roommate Stella," and they talk about how pretty she is, how beautiful she is, which I think it's a little bit odd when almost every other woman, the passage describes it as most of the pictures being of beaux, of fiancés and boyfriends, and Jane doesn't have any of that. She just pulls up a picture of her female roommate. So in my perfect world, this novel would have ended with Jane leaving Tips, who is a complete asshole, and going and staying with Stella forever. Instead, what happens is Jane, of course, agrees to marry Tips because, there were some misunderstandings. Those women who Tips appeared to be running around with, it was one-sided on their part, and he just got pulled into it because he was such a nice guy and he wouldn't push them away, and it was completely Stella's fault that her marriage fell apart because Tips wasn't doing anything. And it's just a little bit annoying and ridiculous, and I really would have liked Jane to go back to London and move back in with Stella, and they could have spent the rest of their life together. But 1942, that's not what happened. Instead, she decided to marry some man that she barely knew who had a history of cheating. So there's that. So, as I said, I'm going to be reading Red Dragon this weekend, and once I finish that, I'm planning to pick up Henri de Balzac's old Garot, which I've had on my shelf for a little while now. I've got this beautiful Everyman's Library edition that I picked up in December, so I will be reading this as well. I hope that you have some excellent reading plans this weekend, and I hope you enjoy them.